Hi, I'm Ryan.
Hi, I'm Jess, and you're listening to Your Therapist Is Not Okay.
On today's episode, we're going to discuss some recent comments that we've received about being fearful of therapists, especially where it comes to being put in inpatient or some kind of involuntary hold. These things are very rare, but it seems like based on the comments, we need to talk about it. Before we dive in, do want to give a trigger warning. We are going to be talking about suicidal ideation and self harm, and we're going to be talking about hospitalization, since that's really the thing that came up from the comments. So let's get into it, and no worries if you need to skip this episode.
So, where this started from actually came from a viral video of Ryan winking about whether or not therapists know clients are lying. Based on that, we can just say right off the bat, we usually don't know and we don't care. If you want to know more about that, listen to our video on lying in therapy. But one of the things that we wanted to address today is all the reactions that we got. There were a lot of comments about this, and probably because the video kind of left a lot to be interpreted, like you could kind of use it as you wanted to. But some of the comments that keep coming up again and again is this fear of actually being truthful in therapy, lest the client gets institutionalized or sent to the psych ward. These are some of the things that clients, you, were talking about when it came to this video. And we just thought, let's make a whole episode and talk about fear.
Absolutely. And really, where we want to start is just to acknowledge that this is an example of where stigma in mental health is still very prevalent,
Yeah.
hasn't gone anywhere, and people's fear is real. The negative experiences they've had is real. And as a way to kind of enter into this, we're just going to read a few of the comments that we received on my very vague video. It's just a wink. And people have really, as Jess said, interpreted it the way that made sense to them. For us, it was really just a way to kind of draw people into exploring this theme of lying. So, again, there is a whole episode recorded on that if you want to know more about how we think about lying.
And I will say that it was a really saucy wink. Like, I've watched that video a couple times, more than a couple, if I'm being honest. And it's like the wait for it and then the wink. Oh, it gets me every time. Like, I get why you're viral, baby. It was a
I
good
mean, what's the
wink.
point in winking if it's not going to be saucy? Am I right?
Yeah.
All right. So we're just going to read the comments. We're not going to read people's usernames. But these were already publicly shared by the authors. So the first one says, in response to the video about lying, well, I'm sorry some people just don't want to go to a psych ward, huh?
Another said, me lying about not wanting to kill myself.
We had one that says, shh, it's our secret. Both of us don't want me to be involuntarily committed.
Another said, sorry, not sorry. I don't want my rights taken away from me and be forced into a hospital against my will just because I'm extra sad. Like, thanks now, I'm sad and wearing an uncomfortable clothes surrounded by people who look at and treat me like scum.
One comment says, if I straight up tell my therapist what's going on, she'll find out about my self harm, and then she'll tell my mom, who will go through putting me in a mental hospital, and I'll likely come out worse than how I was before.
Another said, personally for me, it's primarily financial. Admitting to certain feelings to a mandated reporter will result in thousands of dollars of debt.
And the last one we want to share says, it may also be because I don't want the police contacted and to be sent to a psych ward and stuck in paper scrubs. So when we talk about how this stigma is very present and these fears and experiences are real, they're really captured by those comments. It's clear that some of those folks are very afraid that they will be treated that way. And there are also some folks who have had that experience, is my guess, based on kind of the specificity and some of those specific things like paper scrubs.
And to be honest, like, there's such legitimacy to this. Like, the over and over, we're getting some of these comments that really allow us to see that, like, you've probably had a pretty bad experience,
Mhm.
or you've had one and you now know, I better not share it all. Because if I do, there's going to be some dire consequences. And I actually take that very seriously. There actually are sometimes dire consequences. Like, you're correct.
Yeah. Some of our first impulse when Jess and I were talking about how to write this episode was like, oh, we don't really do that. But we reviewed the comments and we, thought about it more. Just wanted to really open with acknowledging that people have this experience and we're both aware of that. We've both witnessed it personally and professionally. So there is both a long-term history in the psychology field of this happening. We go back to asylums and sanatoriums where people were basically put by the government or doctors or family because they were considered to be untreatable or inconvenient in some way.
Yeah.
Um, and then there is also a lot of involvement with systems like social work systems and childcare systems where this is part of the system. And that was one thing that I had kind of thought about when we were thinking about this is there are certain systems, especially where young people are, maybe foster care, maybe school systems, if they or their families are in contact with social work systems, that's something that does happen in those systems and is often because they're not actually working with a therapist.
Yeah.
They're maybe talking to a school guidance counselor or something like that. That's more
Yeah.
about helping them navigate school and figure out their schedules, and that's that role. And there's often no one at the school who's really going to be able to explore and hold someone's suicidal thoughts.
Yeah.
And that's when often those school personnel might panic out of fear and escalate things to a really high level, like, oh, let's get you to the hospital. And they'll do an assessment. And some people I want to acknowledge go to the hospital and get an assessment, and it's not a negative experience for them.
Yeah.
Lives have been saved by the hospital system.
Yeah. But there are many cases, especially in the comments we're reading, Ryan, where it feels like systems can fail us. And I think that for a lot of people who've gone to these emergency services, it can feel like a revolving door. And it can also be really scary when you're treated in an inhuman way, that you're just a symptom or you're your diagnosis. And I think we're seeing that a lot with comments. It's not just going there, it's when you are there, you can actually have a very bad experience. And that would make us fear going again. I think
Mhm.
for myself, especially in my work with borderline clients, this is something I've seen again and again. And being able to talk to hospital staff, they'll say BPD and bipolar often get the reputation of being unmanageable. And for a lot of my clients, that feels dehumanizing because they see the diagnosis and they will put you in paper scrubs, or there will be people talking down to you or acting as if um, you're wanting safety when it comes to suicide and wanting protection can actually make you feel kind of gross as a person. And this can be really difficult, especially for the clients I'm seeing. I'm not an emergency service. If someone is feeling like they need immediate care, I won't be the person they're calling. And they know that that's part of like our work together and they know who to call. And there can be a real fear there when the very ones that are to kind of care for this emergency mistreat you. It can make you feel very isolated and not necessarily knowing, well, where do I turn to when I actually need immediate help? That's not maybe just a phone hotline or something.
This is a whole system that I really get in a number of different ways. I've been part of this kind of revolving door system when I worked in a residential detox center, and we would have people coming in and out of the hospitals, coming in and out of our facilities, trying to get them into better facilities or different levels of care, but having so many barriers, whether it's finances and insurance or one of the facilities or staff people kind of falling through and it not working out.
Yeah.
Some of this is I want to acknowledge because of burned out staff,
Oh, yeah.
too many clients they see every day, not enough funding, and that kind of the volume that might sometimes come on where people are really just triaging
Yeah.
and taking care of the most severe thing as quickly as possible. This doesn't feel good when you're the person involved sometimes, right?
Yeah, when you've seen 100 clients in a day and you have more coming and you're midway through your shift, it's like, okay, another one, another one. I think
Right.
for a lot of clients that come through those doors, it can make them feel like they are that number.
Yeah. And I think what we want to kind of talk about next is just kind of thinking about when this comes to individual therapists that are working in a group practice or a private practice, kind of the perspective that Jess and I are coming with right now, um, is where does this system interact with therapists? And what's going to happen if you share with a therapist in private practice that you're struggling with suicidal ideation, that you're struggling with self-harm? Because I do want to kind of make a little bit of a break there to say this is not something that Jess and I really do. The very few times in our careers that we've ever had to make that kind of call or do that kind of intervention, even though we both have worked with a lot of clients struggling with suicidal
Yeah.
ideation and self-harm. This is not something that we were going to do quickly,
No.
lightly, or ever if we can help it.
And usually, if we can help it again, which for me at least is almost always, it's not without a conversation.
Right.
In my 15 years of being in the helping field, one time, one time with the client's consent did I call. And it was really because if you walked out my door, you're probably not coming back. And so that was tricky. And part of the trickiness was knowing that after that experience, you're still going to come back and work with me. And we have to work on that level of like a rupture there because I am mandated to act if I'm really fearful. But again, 15 years, one time.
Yep. I started in the addictions field in 2012. When I was in that kind of revolving door niche for a couple of years, I had a lot of interaction with the system. Since then, as an individual therapist, not once
Mm.
have I
Hmm.
had to do that. I've had question marks, right? I've had situations where I've thought, are we there?
Hmm.
And done had that conversation with the client, like you were saying, Jess. Like this is something we're gonna do with discussion and consent. And ideally, really, it's about a client deciding, like, hey, actually, I think I need some more care. Will you help
Yeah.
me get it? And it can be a together thing. And usually when it's something planned ahead and done with support, you're less likely to get chewed up by the kind of triage machine.
Yeah. So I think in this part, we want to talk and we want to take your fears seriously and talk about where they might be coming from.
Yep.
And then we want to tell you what actually will happen based on our experience as psychotherapists. And then we want to talk about like how we navigate this in therapy. So that's kind of how the rest of the episode's going to go. And thinking about what we were reading in the comments, regard like way beyond the ones that we read today, is that there's a real fear of us not necessarily taking clients seriously, believing them, or even just our reactions to their deep pain.
Yeah. Because it's a lot for a client to be vulnerable enough and share, and we're hearing that question mark around what's gonna happen when I do that.
Mhm.
Jess and I also kind of acknowledged there in that conversation that we're like, okay, there's also sometimes people don't want to share this because they want to protect their therapist. Which you brought up, Jess, about like this,
Yeah,
like, oh, you've already had a long day, or you
yeah,
know what, it's 9 a.m. Like, you probably don't want to hear about that, even though we're here for it. We're therapists, as we've talked about before, it's a weird profession, and we're into helping people in this way. If you can't tell us, where are you going to take it, you know?
yeah. Yeah. And I think there's also this aspect of clients have been dropped by therapists. There's a fear about, will you get rid of me if I share too much? If I give you all of it, if I share all the pain, if I tell you how serious it is, will you still be my therapist?
Mhm.
I've had clients that this has happened to. So this is not the kind of thing where it's like a hypothetical. And they've told a therapist exactly like kind of either their history or what they're dealing with and what they're feeling at this time. And a therapist has said, in usual therapist talk, it's beyond the limit of their competency. Now, I love when a therapist can recognize like where we can actually do the work, like where's our skill set. What I'm saying is not necessarily to shame a therapist in that. That's really important. What I am saying is that this can have an obvious impact on a client. And it can really make them feel like there's a vulnerability whiplash, that you've shared everything about yourself, you've been dropped, and now you have the option of, do I start again with a new therapist? What if they drop me again? How many times am I going to have to go through this before I have somebody that feels like they're competent enough? And a very, very clear indication that you're too much, that your trauma is too much, that what you're feeling is too much, that it could really shame how you feel about the very things you're coming to get help for.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I want to just kind of like reiterate too as we're talking about this that like something that I often tell new therapists or trainees is if a client is telling you this, you're the person that they've chosen. So we want to recognize limits of competency and then also think, can I do this with support? Do I have appropriate support where I can do this and honor the client? Because it's often just kind of this fear reaction. It's a hard thing. That's not going to be easy for anyone that this client is in contact with. And that can be such a shaming experience, feeling like a therapist wants to get rid of you.
Yeah.
And then it makes it hard to want to start again. And like my heart really goes out if you had that experience. And I really want to encourage you that if you still need help, keep trying to find the right therapist who's a good fit for you. Let's pivot to talking a little bit about what's likely to happen if you share that you're having suicidal thoughts or doing some self-harm with a private practice therapist. And this will be from the perspective of what would Jess and I do?
So, one thing that Ryan and I, in the lying episode of our podcast, said again and again is that if you lied to us, that's actually for us a chance of celebration because it means there's a deeper trust. And it feels like for a lot of the comments we got, the lying you're saying is about severity. If you go over to a therapist and you say, I know we've been talking about my depression for a few months now. I want to actually let you know it's much bigger for me right now, that I have actually been thinking some pretty scary thoughts. For myself and my practice, you've just trusted me with a huge thing. I will want to openly discuss every aspect of that. If I'm doing my job right, you will never feel ashamed that you've taken it until now to share. I will recognize that this is now you showing me that you trust me and that you want to do deeper work. And I'm going to do everything in my ability to be deeply understanding and also to hold you in that. That it won't be about me not having heard right away. It'll be about you finally taking this opportunity to get real help that you need.
This is one of those cool areas where you can have a trusting relationship with your therapist that in some ways might remind you of maybe a parental figure or a role model in your life or something like that. And sometimes in those relationships, it's not uncommon for us to hear from our parents, like, oh, you should have told me sooner. Why am I
Mm,
just now hearing about this? I love getting to be the person that doesn't say that,
yeah.
that says, thank you for bringing it now. And I understand why this has been hard to bring. That's okay. What I might then move into after we've talked about it and I've heard you out and I've understood you and we've really talked about it in a way that we're not afraid to talk about it. That's one of the most important things about working with suicide is that if you're afraid to say suicide, if you're afraid to say killing myself, killing yourself, we gotta kind of work past that and hear more. How do you want to do that? Are you
Yeah.
thinking about doing that actively, or is it more of something that, if it happens, it happens, and to really understand what it is uniquely for you?
Yes. And I think one of the things actually is that for therapists, they can also be scared of using this language. There's this common thing we do in training with therapists that we say, you bringing this up and using this language isn't going to create a thought. We're not making a client more suicidal because we're engaging. In fact, I think for a lot of clients, I think they'll agree, like being able to actually talk about this at length and in detail with somebody that is taking you seriously and right beside you can actually lessen some of that feeling of isolation, darkness, and hiddenness that'll make it feel so huge in your mind that it occupies this space. Getting it out with a therapist is the space where it can actually maybe feel a little bit more manageable, or you
Mhm.
have more control over what we're kind of facing right now.
Once we've been able to hear you out and understand you, we might do some what I would just call safety planning. That's going to be creating a plan that's unique to the individual client about what are the resources you have to take care of yourself. What are some activities that you can do on your own that help you to feel better? Maybe it's meditating, maybe it's journaling, maybe it's running or drawing. The list is endless and it would be something we tailor to what works for you and what you enjoy. And there'll be some things that you could do with other people. Maybe you'll call a friend. Maybe you'll go for a walk with a friend. Maybe you'll have tea with mom. Something that feels nice for you and people that you can reach out to. And then I'm always going to include emergency resources just in case you feel like I tried these things and it wasn't enough. I want to call the suicide hotline. I want to call a local helpline to get that support. And those are amazing resources that are, in fact, they're in every email signature we send, aren't they, Jess?
Yeah, they are. They're included.
Yep. And I'd want to find, kind of like I described, external things that you can use to help you and also internal things. What are your own resources? You are a smart and skilled person. You can take care of yourself in many ways and get help when you need to. So I'd want to balance both of those.
And I think one of the really cool, ironic things is you're in our office.
Mm,
You already are trying to get help.
yes.
By very much seeing me, you're already doing such incredible work of facing this fear. That's pretty incredible. And I don't think we always remember that. If you're in my office, you're doing it.
You're doing it. And that's something that we would often do when a client is bringing up suicidality, especially if it's feeling like pretty severe that day. We might make plans with them to
Mhm.
say, like, you know what? Are you willing to kind of commit to being here next week? I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to seeing you again and continuing this conversation. And that is something that can be really helpful. It can also be really helpful to make plans with friends or family, to know that like, oh, I'm looking forward to next Tuesday because I'm going to go get coffee with Jack.
Mhm.
And so having those plans, it gives you something to look forward to, and it also is a kind of constant reminder that you're not alone. And then I'm going to bring it up in the future. We're going to talk about it next time. When you come back for that next session, we're going to talk about how is that going today. We're not going to let it be a shameful thing that we sweep under the rug. Never ever. We're going to
Yeah.
talk about it again and can make sure that you really know that it's welcome here and that you can bring it up anytime.
Yeah. How do we navigate this safety in therapy, Ryan? I'm thinking about if you are scared and we're not sure how a therapist is going to act. You and I can only really talk about our two examples. Seems like there's a lot of places where this might not necessarily be met, especially if I'm taking the comments seriously. So let's talk about some really good tips and strategies on how we might actually approach our therapist if there is something big we want to talk about and we don't want to be punished for it.
Absolutely. I think it's a great idea. And we can kind of start by thinking about, if you're with a therapist and you are afraid of what might happen, or you're just completely unaware of what might happen because you've not had that experience before, you can ask. And
Yeah.
I would kind of suggest doing it if you're nervous, do it in a way that's hypothetical. That's like, hey, I've never been to therapy before. It's been a long time since I've had a therapist. I'm wondering, like, what happens if someone tells you that they're planning to kill themselves or
Mhm.
planning to do some self-harm.
How,
And
yeah, how would you navigate it as a
right.
therapist? Mhm.
Yeah, and that's we as therapists we have an obligation and a responsibility that the vast majority of therapists are going to answer to and be responsible to of letting clients know what are our limits, how do we work, what do we do. That's one set of questions that's 100% of the time on the table for me is questions about what I do. there's a handful of personal questions that I might, I don't know about that. But if you're going to ask me, what do you do as a therapist? Every little piece of information is yours. So then you can kind of hear, what do you do if someone says that? What's the process? And you can even ask specifically like, oh, is that like, will you do like mandated treatment for someone or put them on a hold? And you can hear from them, what are those maybe limits of confidentiality? When would they make a phone call to an emergency services kind of person? Um, what is it like to be a mandated reporter? One of our comments acknowledged that mandated reporter thing. And
Mhm.
these are things that in our initial confidentiality conversation, which we can revisit anytime needed as a therapist, we're going to tell clients like there's certain things that I would have to report, like if there's a child being actively abused.
Yep.
Depending on your jurisdiction, might be if there's elders or disabled people being actively abused. Uh, Threats to national security is on that list in pretty much every country. Not a situation I've directly had to deal with.
Me
Some
neither.
countries, suicide risk is on there, and some countries it's not. It really varies a lot. And that, again, when we talk about suicide risk, as any therapist should describe, that's like Jess said earlier, if you walk out the door, I'm not going to see you again. That's
Yeah.
not, I'm thinking about it, it's been on my mind. That's immediate and clear threat to life.
I think that that's a really good distinction that in my personal opinion, I think we've all sometimes thought, what if I wasn't here?
Hmm.
And for a lot of people, there can be, I really wish I wasn't here. I'm not scared of those comments. Most therapists that have been in the field long enough are not scared of those comments. Those are, let's dive deep. And so that's a really cool distinction. The other thing I was going to say, just tying into that, Ryan, is we can also say with a hypothetical, especially in a consult for those who've been dropped before, how do you work with severe trauma? Or how do you work with severe abuse or past? Or is this something that you feel is within your kind of purview of working? If they say, yes, absolutely, you really just got to trust that. If they say, hey, you know what, actually, I have an expert in trauma that could maybe be someone that's better helped, that's a really good use of limits of competency because a client hasn't given you their whole self. And it's a
Hmm.
really excellent thing to do in that very beginning hypothetical, because you can actually then find out, can you meet me? And clients who've been really hurt by the system or they've been dropped or they just haven't had a lot of trust in their life. This is a great place for you just to ask that question. I really don't think you have to share exactly. You can kind of give a bigger, broad kind of overview, but enough to say, like, if I lean on you, will you back away? Because I can't handle that. It's a really good
Hmm.
place to do it.
Absolutely. I'm thinking like in the consult that you have before you decide to stick with someone as a therapist, which most
Yeah.
therapists will offer. And if they don't, then treat the first session like a consult.
Yeah.
Um, that's your chance to interview your therapist for, are you a good fit for me and what I
Mhm.
have to bring? I love those. Those questions are really helpful, Jess. If you're listening to this as a therapist,
Mhm.
remember to be grounded and calm. Keep in mind that if you feel activated by suicide because of your own experiences or those of people you love, those are things that you need to take to your own personal therapy. Those are things that you need to take to your supervisor so that when it inevitably comes up with clients, you're able to be receptive, not reactive. When you're able to listen and ask more questions. Um, This is something that therapists in training might really struggle with. And when we're first training to be a therapist, this can come up, like Jess shared before, where we might have this fear when we're new, or maybe lay people might have this fear too of like, well, if I ask about suicide, am I putting that idea in their head?
Yeah.
And to reiterate, you're not. You're not going to create suicidality by asking a question.
In fact, I think a lot of times by you being able to talk about it, you allow the client to know, as I said before, that this is a safe space. This might be the only space that they
Mm.
get to be honest. And you provide that, that's amazing.
Absolutely. And that's something, again, new therapists, be ready for this. Get the support that you need to be prepared for this. I've worked with trainee therapists that were just terrified of this. I'm like, well, if it's about suicide, then someone else has to take care of it. No, that's us. That's you now. And you can do it. I
Yeah.
know you can do it. And you have the support, you have a supervisor, you have consultation groups, there is literature. You can do this.
There's going to be a lot that we have of just staying with therapists that are going to be outside the books too. There's going to
Hmm.
be situations that you're up against that you might not have studied. That's okay. Humans are complex. But I think some topics that can feel really scary, especially for new therapists, but really for anybody, are things where we don't always know how to talk about it. I'm thinking about like self-harm. And that is so vast and varied that goes so far beyond just physical cutting.
Hmm.
It can be starving. It can be restricted eating in certain ways if we're doing it to punish ourselves. It can be our pulling our hair. There's so many different ways, and being able to know that and like lean into that gap of your knowledge so that when someone's talking to you, you can take it that next level into awareness. Um, I think being able to be aware that the things that most clients, especially in these comments, are fearful of is really our response, taking them
Hmm.
seriously. If they aren't lying to us and they're telling us the real truth, can we still be there? Are they going to be punished for telling us the truth? These are the things I'm hearing in these comments. And you have a real mandate to be a safe space for clients.
Yeah.
And your research is how you do that the best. Or talking to a supervisor, finding out more. And by doing that, you immediately allow yourself to then feel like that pillar that won't just back away because you're also scared.
Yeah. And this will be something that, Jess and I maybe will consider doing another episode about too. Self-harm is actually very different from suicide. And we've mostly talked about suicide today.
Yeah.
Self-harm is a very different thing. So this is another nod to therapists that make sure you're understanding the difference. They're
Yes.
often talked about together because they're two things that are scary and stigmatized.
Yes.
But actually, most people that do self-harm of some form do not attempt or complete suicide. They're very different things. And in fact, they can be things that help keep us alive and help us to tolerate existence. And I really want to do that topic justice, which is why I say maybe we'll talk about it in another episode, whether it's a whole episode or just a part.
I love that you distinguish that. In my training with therapists, I almost always say that exact wording. Love that you did it here. We're about to wrap up, but I think that one of the things that you're, no, I'm going to say, which is if you are struggling, finding a trauma specialist or finding somebody that is gifted within this world, whatever you're bringing, is so life transformative. And I would say that if you've had a bad experience, our heart goes out to you, but don't let it be the thing that stops you altogether. Hopefully,
Mhm.
some of our tips of like how to maybe get a better experience can help you. And if you have questions about that, reach out. For all of you listening, please follow us on Instagram. It's where we get almost all of our engagement from right now and where we love getting and receiving questions. These were not questions, but it felt like something we could actually engage with in a real way. So please do that. And
Thank you to our commenters, and thank you everyone for your engagement. Please keep engaging, and it's been a pleasure having you with us today. And keep in mind, we're not okay.
thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, check out our others. And stay tuned for even more episodes coming up.
Follow us and leave a review on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please tell your friends.
You can also follow us on Instagram too at Your Therapist Is Not Okay. Also, if you have any questions that you want us to answer, send us a DM there. We would love to answer your questions. And a lot of our topics come from listeners just like you.